Version 21.0 came out a few days ago, and with it brought major buffs to the Prince of Darkness. So I'm going to be showcasing the Prince of Darkness with Overclocked Pat on Flooded Valley. I found out that Pat is actually the best hero to use Prince of Darkness with, or Pod for short, because even though Azili actually directly buffs Pod, Pat provides this stun, it ends up being way more important than the plus 50% pierce and lifespan, it is a nice buff, but it makes the mid game a lot harder before you get Pod, as well as making the late game harder because you just don't have enough control over the balloons themselves. Especially MOABs and BFBs present a lot of issue, and if you have nothing to break the ZOMG layers, those also present issue. So basically everything. Although another issue that I noticed when trying Azili with Pod is that you have Mopex, but that doesn't actually add anything to the graveyard. It adds one pop, which is obviously like a bad thing, because you'd think, oh, you use Mopex and that automatically you eat a ZOMG and that gives you 3000 in graveyard, but that's not how it actually works so far. I don't know if they're planning to change that, but as it is, Azili and Pod don't really have that great of a synergy. So I got Necromancer. I had to get downdraft for around 40. It also helps saving up to Pod because as long as you break the MOABs, then you can downdraft them back into a region where you can pop with good enough micro. Obviously you can see that Pat is kind of carrying the mid-game MOABs before getting Pod, because he can knock them back pretty much indefinitely, which is really nice. It's also kind of a key component of the strategy. Late game, same MOAB knockback carries over into late game. It's super useful, and of course, if you didn't already know, he has really good stuns, and it is a permanent stun if you give him enough buffs. And that's what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be overclocking Pat, and I'm also going to be giving him Stronger Stimulant, the flagship buff, and Jungle Drums. So once I've got Pod, the mid-game becomes a lot easier because, well, obviously Pod is better than Necromancer. I had to use Big Squeeze to beat round 60, but once I actually have my graveyard up and going, then everything gets a lot easier. Same with, like, on rounds like 63, you just have to get lucky with your spawns and also micro your downdraft and stuff to kind of start the whole process of spawning the zombies. And once you've seeded it, then it kind of sustains itself. I decided here to just get Overclock first to overclock Pat, but it honestly would have been easier if I decided that I was going to go for Flagship first. Because I do need a Flagship for late game to put my other support there, like anything that will buff Pat. Unfortunately, even with Pod, you can't really get out of using Flagship on Flooded Valley, unless you're going with a strategy that uses, I don't know, something like the biggest one, or if you're just going with Water Towers. Because, you know, Water Towers you can use Brickle, Subcommander, etc., and obviously you don't need Flagship for that. But as it is, I'm just going to try to get Flagship because it makes my life a lot easier. So once we get to the late 80s, I'll have my whole setup going, and you can see like how the permastone works, what buffs you need to do it. I think just Overclock, Stronger Stimulant, and Jungle Drums is enough. But the Flagship buff makes it even more consistent, which is good because on Flooded Valley he's hitting from two sides, so you kind of want more than 100% uptime on the stun. Another thing to note is that this is something that maybe confused a few people in the patch notes, but Overclock does still have 100% uptime on heroes unless they're level 20, and it's been said that the level 20 not having full uptime is a bug. Also, on tier 4 monkeys, Overclock has full uptime, and on tier 5 it has 2/3 uptime. This is because the way they said in the patch notes is based off of a 100% duration was considered to be 60 seconds, however the cooldown of Overclock is actually 45 seconds, so given that 75% uptime actually means that it's 100%. So One thing I will say is that you can overclock pod. It's something that I didn't do in this run because I didn't have money for it, and I also wasn't sure if it would be a good thing. Overclocking pod is sometimes beneficial if you know that you're going to be popping everything fast enough that you're always going to have enough zombies to keep yourself near max graveyard, but if you don't, then it's not a good idea to overclock pod, and instead you should probably get some other defense and just make sure that everything's consistent. So now that you can see how the Permastone works, I will mention that this strategy was also sort of used with Glavelord, not on Flooded Valley, but on other maps, including Muddy Puddles and Workshop. And the way that that works is really similar, where you just clump everything together and get it to use up all of its Pierce. I will say that Pod now is pretty much better than Glavelord in every respect of that, except that Pod has no bad damage, and Glavelord obviously does with the main attack added in version 18.0 or so. Might have been 16 actually. That is a very high single target DPS attack. So that's one advantage because like in this run, for example, I have to get Spike Storm and First Strike just to beat round 100. So if I had, let's say I had Glavelord instead, then that would not be an issue at all. Although, I mean, there's really no good place to put a Glavelord here. Even if you had it on a flagship, which I guess you'd probably end up doing, like, there's not a curve or anything at all like there is on Workshop or Muddy Puddles. That being said, Glavelord did get a pretty big buff this update. It got 1.5x damage overall, and the 502 crosspath got an additional 1 damage. So it's definitely better at doing cleanup now. I did some tests with that. Also, it's important to note that you can buff Glavelord with Overclock and Jungle Drums and Stronger Stimulant. A lot of people think it doesn't work, but it does. It buffs the attack speed and the damage, etc. I think it's because people got that confused with Spirit of the Forest, which you cannot buff, except with Mib. Mib is literally the only buff that works on it for some reason. I think probably like the way it might be, because of the way that it might be unbuffable, is that they wanted it to be unbuffable in general, but they made a special case exception for Mib because they figured, like, people might want it to be able to hit DDTs. But you can't buff its attack speed, damage, etc. I mean, you can't buff its Pierce either, but it has infinite Pierce, so buffing wouldn't do anything. So we move on to the hard part of this, which is really the last 3 rounds are very hard, especially 98, which is something I actually notice a lot when I do these Flooded Valley runs. Like, the game is actually pretty easy until 98, 99, 100, and then it's just like everything becomes way harder. So my strategy for 98, this took like a lot of attempts, is that I was going to get Shattering, and I was going to build my First Strike, which I need for around 100. I'm going to build that, and I'm going to use it once during the round so that I can clean up some of the stuff that spawns. So in addition to that, I also got Snowstorm, and I got another Mob Press. Snowstorm I did use during this round. I also use it on round 100, although that's not strictly necessary. Basically, the main reason for getting it is to have more placement space, because Mob Press is very useful on pretty much every round. Even after the nerf, it's still good, although it was a very significant nerf. It was basically 024 Mob Press is only 2/3 as good as it used to be. And the fact that it's still really good just goes to show you kind of how busted it was before. If you saw, I did another video previously where I had a bunch of Mob Presses and Impale with Etienne unflooded, and it was very clear that what they were doing there was a bit too much. So for 99, this actually also took a lot of attempts just because the timing was really strict. So you need to reapply Overclock during the round instantly as soon as it wears off, because if you don't, then the DDTs will slip by. And I also got a nice lucky zombie spawn there to beat that last DDT. So I did try a lot of things for around 100, and I ended up getting bigger stacks on the Spike Factory. I got Jungle Drums, and then so I used Spike Storm, and then I just used First Strike to break the bad layer and kill the DDTs, but I left the ZOMGs there because I couldn't deal enough damage like before the bad exited, so I just left the ZOMGs and I let the Pat knock them back, and it worked out fine. So that being said, this is the end of the run with Pod main DPS on Flooded Valley. The total pops add up to less than 2 million because of a bug with Shattering Shells where it doesn't count as many pops as it should. But there's a showcase of the Prince of Darkness and the good synergy with Pat and Overclock.